Now, my good colleague from Texas says 94% of voters said voting was easy in 2020. So why don't we keep it that way? Isn't it true that all of the changes that we are arguing about are post-2020? And is it an overwhelming likelihood that this number, if these changes are allowed to go into effect, will go way down? So yes, we agree. Keep the 2020 laws. Maybe we should improve them. But right now, what we're combating is a series of legislators, 33 laws that will make this number surely go down because it makes voting less hard. So we agree. 2020 worked out okay. I guess my friend is saying the big lie is false because Donald Trump said it was fraudulent, the election results. I would thank my colleague for his chart, and we'll be using it again.
Mr. President, would the senator yield for a question?
I sure would.
Can you give me an example of one of the laws passed in Georgia or Texas since the 2020 election, which you believe suppresses the right to vote?
There are a long list of them, which I've listed in my speeches. Let me just give one or two. One, making early voting places and drop-off voting places many fewer. Number two, taking in the largest county, Democratic county, African-American county in Georgia, and taking away the bipartisan ability to collect those votes. Three, in Georgia, making it a crime that if you're standing on line, you can't be fed, and the lines, by the way, according to the reports I get, are much longer in African-American communities than in white suburban communities, making it much, much harder, making it a crime, rather, to give people water or sandwich. So I'm going to now give my remarks, but I thank my colleague for the question, and I'm going to take the floor.
Mr. President,
so,
if I can just
Mr.
ask one more question, clarify
last question.
The response.
Yes.
Is the senator suggesting that ballot harvesting should be required in all 50 states? That is, the ability of a partisan or participant in a political election to go around to nursing homes or to other vulnerable populations and collect ballots and turn them in?
If the gentleman would yield, as long as there's no fraud, if a person in a nursing home can't get to the polling place and they want to vote, and someone collects their ballot, nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's good. That makes it easier for them to vote. All of these things that they bring up, there's been no evidence of fraud. None. Donald Trump has not produced any evidence of fraud. He lost by 7 million votes, and yet he's saying he won the election. And we all know what's motivating our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Obeisance to Donald Trump. I would guess most of them know that the election was not stolen, that the big lie doesn't take effect. But Trump has such power over the Republican Party, such power, that they do what he wants in the legislatures and here in the Senate. And I would remind my good friend from Texas that his fellow Texans, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, proudly supported extension of the Voting Rights Act. Proudly did that. It was bipartisan until Donald Trump came over and, in my opinion, poisoned the Republican Party on voting rights. We could use a little resistance to Donald Trump. We see it from a good number of Republicans out in the country. We see it from a good number of Republican commentators. But we don't see it here in the Senate, and that's unfortunate, and I'm not going to yield for a further question. So, Mr. President, as I begin my remarks, let me begin with the following figure.
Mr. President, would the
we'll have a
senator yield
debate
for
later.
a question?
The Majority Leader.
Thank you. Mr. President, let me begin with the following figure. 55 million people. That's the estimated number of eligible voters that now live within states that have passed legislation restricting the right to vote and potentially undermine the electoral process. Today, President Biden will travel to one such state, Georgia, home to one of the most egregious voter suppression and election subversion laws we have seen in a long time. I believe the President will give a strong speech and will urge that we in the Senate change the rules so that we can prevent these awful and nasty laws from being implemented. In an address to the nation, he will use the bully pulpit of the presidency to make the case that the time has come for the Senate to pass voting rights legislation and take whatever steps necessary to address this chamber's rules in order to accomplish that goal. The Senate is going to act as soon as tomorrow. It is my intention to once again bring legislation to the floor to fight back against the threats to democracy and protect people's access to the ballot. Once again, I urge my Republican colleagues to take up the flag of the traditional Republican Party, not only of Lincoln, but of Reagan and H.W. Bush and W. Bush, and vote yes to move forward so we can have a debate like the debate we just had, or discussion we just had. But if Republicans continue to hijack the rules of the Senate to prevent voting rights from happening, if they continue paralyzing this chamber to the point where we're helpless to fight back against the big lie, we must consider the necessary steps we can take so the Senate can adapt and act. For the past few months, Senate Democrats have been holding talks within our caucus to discern how we can best move forward to restore the function of the Senate, and more importantly, pass legislation to defend democracy and protect voting rights. Last night, I held another round of talks with a number of my colleagues about the path forward, and we did so again this morning. Over the past few days, our Republican colleagues have escalated their attacks against our efforts to pass voting rights legislation. Listen to this one. Last night, the Republican leader worked to place a number of gotcha bills onto the legislative calendar as some sort of payback for pursuing legislation to protect the sacred right to vote. He was basically saying, here are 18 bills that Democrats don't like. Let's go for 50 votes on those. Well, I proposed to the Republican leader in a unanimous consent request that it would be perfectly fine with us taking votes on his bills on a simple majority threshold if in exchange he agreed to do the same for the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Of course, the Republican leader immediately objected to having all of them done with 50 votes, the 18 bills he proposed and our 2 voting rights bills. The Republican leader made clear last night that the true worry on the other side isn't about the rules of the Senate, rules they were perfectly happy to change to pursue their own objectives when they were in the majority. Republicans, in truth, are afraid of the possibility that legislation to defend democracy, to fight the power of dark money, and protect voting rights could move forward in this chamber. And as I mentioned to my colleague from Texas, that's not all Republicans. That's not Republicans out in the country. A lot of them want to protect voting rights. But it's the Republican Party, as now run by, and it's fair to say run by, Donald Trump, who has propagated the big lie that the election was stolen, that he really won, even though he lost by 7 million votes, and even though he has no evidence, nor have the commentators in that effect. And now we have at least Republicans in the Senate and the House and in lots of state legislatures completely going along with this big lie. And the danger there is it jaundices our democracy. If people of color, if young people, if older people, if people in urban areas feel that their right to vote is being diminished compared to other people, because they're not aiming this at everybody, democracy begins to wither. We have not seen an assault on voting rights since the days of the Old South, since the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. Why would we want to regress? Why would we want to regress? So, we must fight back. Now, I understand our Republicans are going to continue their opposition through a flurry of speeches, decrying any effort by Democrats to undo these voter suppression laws and make it easier for Americans to vote. And by the way, again, I'd remind my colleagues, that's been the grand tradition of America. When the Constitution was written, most states you had to be a white, male, Protestant property owner to vote. No one says let's go back to those days. And in general, America, with our march to freedom and our march to equality, embodied in our Constitution and in the great minds of the Founding Fathers, the greatest group of geniuses ever assembled, have marched forward. There have been regressions, but have marched forward. We Democrats want to continue that march. We want to stop these types of laws. So the Republican leader doesn't have much to say. So he's latched onto a talking point, and he said the big lie is actually the warnings of voter suppression that come from Democrats, even though there are so many laws that are obviously done to suppress votes, and a lot of these Republican legislators say it openly. So I'd say to the Republican leader, his attempts to misdirect from the danger of Donald Trump's big lie and try to say it's Democrats who are doing it is gaslighting, pure and simple. No evidence. No evidence. The leader did it again yesterday and today on the floor, implying one more time that because the 2020 election was indeed successful, somehow voter suppression doesn't exist. Now, I answered my friend from Texas when he held up that chart. The Republican leader cherry-picked examples to distract from the real unmistakable changes that are taking place in the states. And I would ask the Republican leader, the Republican senator from Texas, and every other Republican, if the 2020 election was as successful, as secure, as safe as he says it was, then why have Republican state legislators rushed to make it harder for people to vote in the aftermath of the 2020 election? And why can any Republican cling to the view that the election was stolen, Donald Trump's big lie, when John Cornyn, my friend from Texas, is up there with a chart saying the 2020 election was successful, and the Republican leader said the same thing? Doesn't that rebut Donald Trump? Doesn't that rebut those who came to the Capitol motivated by Donald Trump's propagation of the big lie? Doesn't it rebut all the state legislators who want to make it harder to vote if the 2020 election was successful? Despite the Republican leader's best efforts, I have yet to hear from my Republican colleagues why it's okay for states like Georgia to make it a crime to give food and water to people waiting online at the polls, when we hear that in minority areas and in urban areas the lines are much longer than in rural areas. I have yet to hear from Republicans why states like Texas and Arizona have made it a felony for nonpartisan election workers to send in unsolicited mail ballot applications to voters. What's wrong with sending that? What's wrong with encouraging people to vote? The participation in elections is much higher in many Western countries than in ours. And again, Texas didn't just prohibit nonpartisan election workers to send mail ballots out to voters. They made it a felony. A felony. These states have effectively made it a crime for election workers to proactively helping people vote. Where is the justification? Where's the evidence of this massive fraud that Donald Trump talks about? No one gives any. And yet they predicate their policy moves here in the Senate on that. And to date, I've heard no explanation from the other side why states like Texas, Iowa, and Montana have reduced polling locations in hours. In Iowa, early voting of any kind has been cut by 9 days. How does that make the election more secure? Why is that in the grand tradition of making it easier for Americans to vote? And in Georgia, according to the Atlanta Constitution-Journal, the leading newspaper of Atlanta, the number of absentee drop boxes in 4 large counties in Atlanta, in the Atlanta area, will drop from 111 to 23. 111 to 23. One of the justifications is that these boxes are no longer helpful. But this ignores the fact that over 300,000 voters used them in the last election, the last successful election, according to my friend from Texas. Republicans know that most of the people who used those drop boxes, of course, were Democrats. They tend to use them more, and that's why they cut them off. The examples go on, unfortunately, Mr. President. This is not just a one-off or one state or another. This is a massive campaign, which if we do nothing will continue and get worse. States like Texas, Florida, Kansas, Iowa, New Hampshire, and Montana have passed laws making it harder to register to vote. States like Alabama, Iowa, and Texas have passed laws that increase the potential barriers for people with disabilities. And again in Georgia, one rural county, Lincoln County, is trying to limit their polling places to just one in the whole county. Just one place to vote for an entire county, causing people to potentially drive as many as 23 miles to cast a ballot. This wouldn't make voting easier, turns it into a burden. The truth is, our Republicans can't defend these laws. They're not going to mention them here today. Let's hear some Republicans defend these laws and point to evidence of the massive fraud that they say motivates them to do it. It's bunk. The policies they have put forward have one purpose only, making it harder for younger, poorer, non-white, and typically Democratic voters to access the ballot, to give Republicans a partisan advantage at the polls by making it harder for Democratic-leaning voters to vote. Again, in a democracy, when you lose an election, you figure out why and try to win over the voters you lost. You don't stop the voters you lost from voting. That's what happens in autocracies. Places like Hungary, where Donald Trump just endorsed Orban, who is whittling away at democracy in Hungary. It is cynical for our Republican colleagues to argue that just because these voter suppression laws don't spell out their intentions out in the open, that there's nothing sinister at play. But these laws have real impact, potentially divisive. In Arizona, Mr. President, your state, the Secretary of State has concluded that new laws could purge as many as 200,000 voters from their early voting list. And as you know better than me, Arizona has a long tradition of early and mail voting that I think was set up by Republicans, if I'm not wrong. In Georgia, over 1.3 million voters used absentee ballots in the last election, could now be affected by the restriction. Senate Democrats in Iowa argue that if today's voter suppression laws had been in effect in 2020, over 6,500 absentee ballots would not have been counted in the last election. And this isn't all difficult to comprehend. When you pass laws that raise barriers to voting, fewer people end up voting. That's a fact. So, as the President will say later, we're approaching a decisive moment for the country. Voting rights, defending democracy have long been bipartisan issues in this chamber. The Voting Rights Act of 1964 is one of the crowning achievements, not only of the civil rights era, but in the history of this chamber. It's in no way a power grab to say the Senate will pass laws that make it easier, simpler, and safer for American citizens to exercise their most fundamental right. That's been part of the grand tradition of this country, usually, as I mentioned several times before, bipartisan. I'll add, as we proceed, we cannot hang our hats on the false hopes of inadequate or sometimes chimerical solutions. Substituting the Electoral Count Act for the much-needed reforms that we have in the Freedom to Vote and John Lewis Voting Rights Act is insufficient, unacceptably. Obviously, it doesn't affect the House and Senate. Obviously, it's not immediately urgent because it affects 2024. But most importantly, scorekeeping matters little if the game is rigged, and the game is in danger of being rigged if state Republicans empower themselves to arbitrate the results of future elections instead of it being arbitrated by what traditionally has happened in America, by nonpartisan election workers. So, we need to work in this chamber to pass real solutions that go to the heart of the problem. We need to proceed with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We need to proceed with the Freedom to Vote Act. All of us in this chamber must make a choice about how we'll do our part to preserve our democratic republic. We can't be satisfied in thinking that democracy will win out in the end if we're not willing to put work in to defend it. So we need to pass these bills so our democracy can long endure after this present danger. To continue blocking these efforts is to offer an implicit endorsement of Donald Trump's big lie, which unfortunately is alive and well in 2022. I yield the floor.